Good morning, everybody. It's Jeff Sachs here, and thank you for joining the Google Hangout. Maybe I'll start before we turn to questions with a little bit of an update on the United Nations meetings in the past 2 weeks. You know, every September we have the General Assembly opening, and that's when the heads of state come to give their messages to their global colleagues. And very often at the time of the General Assembly opening, there are also special meetings that are important on key issues of the day. And on September 23rd this year, there was a special climate summit, which I'm sure that many of you were following. This was a one-day event to discuss the urgency of the human-induced climate change and the negotiations that are underway right now. The idea was to give a jump start to a process that's now going to last 14 months until Paris 2015, which will be the COP21, the 21st meeting of the Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And a number of world leaders spoke, President Obama among them, and there was a generally good session with governments and businesses saying that they are committed to reaching a climate agreement next year. There were a couple of other notable meetings at the onset of the General Assembly as well. There was a meeting of the world's indigenous populations. There are about 400 million people of the 7.3 billion people in the world who are indigenous populations. These are native populations that are the kind of first arrivers in the respective countries. Native Americans, the First Nations in Canada, the Aboriginals in Australia, the Maori in New Zealand, the Orang Asli in Malaysia, and so on. And worldwide, these populations are often, typically have been reviled, discriminated against, and live in difficult environments, pushed into forests or mountain or desert or dryland environments or on reservations. And it's only in the last 20 or 30 years, I would say, that there has been a growing social awareness of the plight of indigenous populations. So the UN has become a place where worldwide the indigenous populations are meeting and demanding rights. And so that meeting took place as well. There was a third meeting on the 20th anniversary of the Cairo Conference on Sexual and Reproductive Rights, which also came to discuss issues of maternal health and access to contraception. And this is also a crucial topic for us, of course, because the dynamics of population and the discrimination of women in access to public services remain huge barriers to sustainable development. So this was the framework of the week. I was more or less satisfied, I would say, with the climate meeting. I think the other two issues on maternal health and indigenous populations really deserve a lot more attention. On climate, we now have a complicated diplomatic and negotiating process that will last, as I've said, a little over a year, hopefully culminating in an agreement in Paris in December 2015. I think there's a good chance that there will be an agreement. The question is whether it's a good agreement or merely a photo op. A good agreement would be one that keeps the climate safe. And one standard for safety is to remain below 2 degrees Celsius in global warming relative to the pre-industrial average Earth temperature. The Earth has already warmed on average by 0.9 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial baseline. It's on a path to warm by 4 to 6 degrees Celsius before the end of the 21st century. All of the evidence is that that would be calamitous, with huge disruptions to all aspects of our lives: food production, public health, extreme storms, rising sea levels, and many other very worrisome trends. So the question is whether the world can agree on a rapid change of energy and agriculture and other human systems in time to keep the rise of temperature below the 2 degrees Celsius limit that has already been agreed by governments as the upper limit of safety for the planet. That's the goal for the 2015 agreement. And now there will be a summit in Lima, Peru in December of this year called COP20, the 20th meeting of the Conference of the Parties. And then a year from now, 21st meeting, at which time the governments are committed to actually reaching an agreement. It's going to be a very close call. We're going to be talking a lot about that in the coming months. Now, one more point that I want to make before turning to your questions, and that is that this year we had those special sessions. Next year, there will be a massive 3-day event at the United Nations, I think the longest such and biggest such event in its history, on sustainable development. So a year from now, world leaders are scheduled on the calendar to come to UN headquarters to have a 3-day session on sustainable development at head of state level to adopt sustainable development goals, or SDGs, which we know are absolutely crucial for the future if we're going to change direction from our unsustainable trajectory to a sustainable trajectory. So we're now in the 1-year countdown to negotiate meaningful, implementable sustainable development goals, and then to adopt them at a 3-day special session in New York in September 2015. Well, let me turn to your questions. There are a lot of very good ones. Let me start with Una Constantinescu. Do you believe, Professor Sachs, that the recent pledge made by the Rockefeller family members and others of divesting from fossil fuel will have a significant influence in shifting focus towards development of sustainable, renewable sources of energy? Well, I think the fact that the Rockefeller Family Foundation, remembering that Rockefeller wealth came from petroleum, came from Standard Oil, the first huge oil trust of the United States. When the Rockefeller Family Foundation said that they would divest from fossil fuels, it opened a lot of eyes. First, the irony, of course, was overwhelming. The signal that it sent, because it's not just the Rockefeller Foundation family, but many pension funds around the world and social impact investors and others are now similarly divesting from fossil fuel industries. It's starting to send a signal. It's not quantitatively by itself big enough to change the behavior of the oil industry or to choke investment from the oil sector. But the recognition that there is a basic contradiction in that the oil industry already has enough proved reserves of oil and gas, and when you combine it with the proved reserves of coal, to have all the fossil fuel that can be safely burned within the 2 degrees Celsius carbon limit, is posing a question. Why are we exploring for more oil, gas, and coal when the amounts of oil, gas, and coal already in proved reserves is beyond the amount that can be safely used if we want to stay within the 2 degrees Celsius budget? This is a basic policy challenge, and I would say a contradiction. The world has agreed to a 2 degrees Celsius limit on global warming. That means that the greenhouse gas emissions that are causing the global warming have to be cut back sharply. That means the amount of coal, oil, and gas that can be safely burned is less by far than what we're burning right now, and that less than what we already have as proved reserves. And yet, the fossil fuel industry is still investing hundreds of billions of dollars in new exploration. So something isn't right yet. And when you ask ExxonMobil or Chevron, well, why are you still investing? They say, we don't believe that the 2 degrees Celsius limit will be enforced by governments. This is, in my opinion, a rather strange answer, because it's not just a matter of whether they believe it or not, it's whether they're acting responsibly or not. And I do believe that all critical stakeholders in this process, including governments in the oil sector and cities that purchase energy from utility companies and so forth, have to understand that we need to cut back sharply on the amount of fossil fuel that we're using. The divestment movement is one part of that. It is significant as a signal. It's probably modestly significant in terms of affecting the cost of capital of the industry, but I would say only by a small amount so far. But it's most important as a message to the world that the status quo, where the fossil fuel industry just carries on as if there were no limits to the safe use of fossil fuels, that era is over. And we have to move to an era where we decide consciously through public policy of one kind or another to cut back sharply on the amount of fossil fuel emissions. So the answer to your question, Una, is Oana, I guess it is that this does make a difference. It really opened up a lot of eyes. Another thing, by the way, that made a lot of difference a couple of weeks ago was the climate march, where an estimated 300,000 New Yorkers were out on the streets, matched roughly sixfold by a worldwide total of somewhere around 2 million people marching in cities around the world for a safe climate. And they too were trying to send a message to the world political leaders and business leaders that we can't go on with business as usual. So here's another important question. This is from Alexander Passaro. Professor Sachs, are you convinced that economic growth and environmental sustainability can go hand in hand? Consider, for example, the so-called rebound effects. Should we not try to work for a general reduction in terms of consumption? In other words, an economy of sufficiency rather than an economy of maximum consumption. Well, first, let me describe the rebound effect. The rebound effect says that if there is an improvement of efficiency in energy use, for example, if the energy input to a particular process can be cut, that doesn't necessarily end up with less energy use, because it could result in far more demand for that service. A classic example is the improvement of the internal combustion engine in the last 30 years, where the internal combustion engine in the United States became far more efficient, but rather than taking the efficiency mainly in the form of reduced petroleum use per kilometer driven, it was taken in the form of much, much larger cars and SUVs. And therefore, there was more efficiency, but not a reduction in the petroleum use because of the so-called rebound effect. The question is more general, and it's an excellent and very important question. Can we combine economic growth and sustainability? And this will be discussed throughout the course. It is a question of whether we can have economic growth that takes place within the so-called planetary boundaries, the thresholds of resource use, whether it's water or land or energy or fossil fuels, that is consistent with the effective continued functioning of the Earth's ecosystems. In principle, the way that this could happen would be if the technologies that we use in the future are far more resource sparing. In other words, if we can decouple economic growth from resource use. That's the big question. And specifically, let's take the case of fossil fuels and climate change. The basic idea is the following. When we burn coal, oil, and gas, the carbon that is the basis of those fuels is combusted with oxygen and it produces carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide enters the atmosphere. Roughly about half of what's burned enters the atmosphere. The other part goes into the oceans and into the land. The part that enters the atmosphere is a greenhouse gas, having the effect of warming the planet by absorbing infrared radiation that is radiated from the Earth. That warming is dangerous. So the question is, can we have economic growth, but also cutting back sharply carbon dioxide? Now, you might have three different ways of doing that. One would be to stop economic growth in general, even cut back sharply on our living standards. A second way might be to economize on energy use per se, not consumption broadly, but just that part that causes the CO2 emissions, the total energy use. A third, even more refined approach might be to say, no, we don't care about energy per se. If the energy comes from wind and solar power or geothermal energy, for example, then that's not a problem. The problem is the energy that comes specifically from fossil fuels. So rather than talking about ending growth or talking about cutting consumption or even talking about lowering sharply energy use, we ought to be talking specifically about the real problem being burning fossil fuels, and therefore a need to switch from fossil fuels to safe energy sources, or if that's not possible, then yes, to cut down on energy use. The basic point is that in general, when you face an economic problem, it's good to be as specific as possible in the remedy of that problem. If the problem is carbon dioxide, then the remedy should be focused on restricting the sources of those carbon emissions. In this case, overwhelmingly, that is fossil fuels. That's why I prefer not to talk about stopping consumption in general or stopping growth in general, but rather in cutting back sharply, in fact, the fossil fuel use. That specifically is called decarbonization. It says energy, boy, we need energy. Energy is great. Electricity is fantastic. That's how we're communicating with each other. And we could be driving vehicles that way, and our homes could be heated and cooled with electricity rather than with furnaces or boilers that are burning fuel oil. So nothing wrong with energy per se, if it can be harnessed in an environmentally safe manner. To do that requires shifting from fossil fuels to low carbon energy sources, that process of decarbonization. But then you can ask the question, is it really possible? Can we really decarbonize the energy system? Or to put it another way, can we really decouple economic growth from carbon emissions? Because if economic growth and carbon emissions go lockstep together so that you can't have one without also having the other, then the problem really is much more serious. And then if we want to stop climate change, we're going to have to stop growth. So the question, practically speaking, is it possible to decouple growth and CO2 emissions? Or to put it in other words, is it possible to decarbonize the energy system? My sense is the answer is yes, we could have that kind of decoupling. And the project that we are undertaking right now to investigate that is called the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, or DDPP. And you can find the report of DDPP online. I'm pretty sure it's on our reading list. I'll make sure that you have the references to it. I'll tweet those out after the Google Hangout so that you can download the DDPP report. That is an approach of delinking or decoupling, and that's the kind of approach I tend to favor. Now, why don't I favor more generally stopping economic growth? That's because of two reasons. One, when you work in low income and middle income countries, they want improved living conditions. And they say, why should we suffer in extreme poverty or in poverty while the rich countries have higher living standards? That's not fair. And so the will to continued economic growth in the low-income countries is quite powerful and I believe quite understandable. The second reason is I think that if we define growth properly as changes of our economic life that raise well-being, truly raise well-being, then we should say, oh, we don't want to stop that. We don't want to stop progress towards economic well-being. What we do want to stop is economic growth that isn't really contributing to well-being. For example, economic growth that is destroying natural capital, economic growth that is leading to more congestion, to lower quality of life. That kind of economic growth we're not interested in. But economic growth that leads to longer life expectancy, better health conditions, more education, more fulfilling lives, we don't want to stop. We might have to stop some of it, especially in the high income countries, if decoupling isn't possible. But I think we should start at the crux of the problem with our irresponsible and unsustainable primary resource use, whether it's the fossil fuels or land or destruction of biodiversity or using too much water, rather than at the very high-end abstraction of stopping economic growth per se. Let me take another question. These are all very good ones. Nicole Helwig. So this is actually quite similar, but it'll give me a chance to discuss another aspect of this problem. It says, with population growth and rising spending power in the developing world and overconsumption in much of the developing world, what is recommended in terms of change in consumer behavior for sustainable development? Basically the same kind of question. It comes to the definitions of what we mean by consumption, how our consumer goods are produced, and whether our consumer goods are leading to increased well-being, and how we can better target our consumption activities to ultimate human purposes. Let me start out with the population part of the question. We're now at 7.3 billion people. When I started the course, I said 7.2 billion people. According to the UN population clock, we are now at 7.265 billion people. So rounding up we're now at 7.3 billion, to the closest 100 million. This is a lot, and since the population is rising roughly 75 to 80 million people, 75 to 80 million people per year net, we'll reach 8 billion people by around 2024, 2025. and 9 billion people by the early 2040s, and on the current trajectory, 10 billion people by around 2080, and so forth. Of course, long-term extrapolations are very uncertain because things can change. We hope they don't change on the catastrophic side, on the mortality part of the dynamic. In other words, more deaths. That would be the horrible way to have populations stabilize. But they could change on the fertility side, that places that tend to be very poor, that still have very high fertility rates. For example, in much of Africa, where women on average are having 5 or 6 or even 7 children, and therefore leading to a very rapid rise of population from one generation to the next. These fertility rates could be brought down considerably through improved access for girls to secondary and tertiary education, meaning that girls would not marry so young, would not start having children so young, would enter the labor force, would choose to have fewer children over time, better health care, better access to family planning and contraception, and so forth. So the first thing I would say about our consumption behavior is, yes, it does matter how many mouths there are to feed in the world, as they say. And right now, the trajectory is to reach more than 10 billion people by the end of the 21st century. But it would be possible to see the world stabilize population by mid-century at probably around 8.5 billion people, and then to be coming down in the second half of the century because fertility rates have come down so significantly. This, I believe, is the kind of adjustment that will lead to human well-being at a much higher rate, with a peak of population at mid-century and then a decline thereafter. It will make it easier for poor people to get out of poverty. It will make it easier to meet the food needs of the world population. It will be easier to meet the needs for water, land, and other primary commodities that support our lives. And so in many, many ways, we will have an easier time of achieving sustainable development if there is a voluntary yet significant reduction of fertility rates in the coming years. Now, let's assume that that happens. That's still not enough, because we still require decoupling of our primary resource use from the economic growth that remains. And the kind of decoupling we need is not only decarbonization, as I've described earlier, it's also reducing our water usage, especially in places that are dryland parts of our world where water is already under stress. It means being more efficient with land, so that instead of cutting down rainforests in the Amazon or the Congo Basin or Indonesia, we can get more output per unit of land than we do right now. It means protecting rather than destroying other biodiversity. So we have to decouple economic growth from our primary commodity use of air, water, land, biodiversity, greenhouse gases, and so forth. That's really the challenge. If this can be done, then consumption could continue to rise. But as I emphasized in the preceding question, there's a deep issue, which is consumption of what? If it's just of more and more physical goods, the evidence suggests that that's also not going to raise living standards of the rich, at least, very much, because they already have, the rich already are consuming vast amounts of material goods. It would make a big difference for the poor to have access to more material consumption. But in general, we need to understand much better how to direct consumption towards things that really count, that raise the quality of our lives, that improve health, knowledge, education, community well-being, and leisure, for example, which should be one of the benefits of our technological age. So again, as I emphasized in the previous question, and I'll emphasize it again for Nicole's question, it's not stopping consumption per se or turning economic development into reverse, which actually would leave billions of people in a very difficult circumstance. It's being a lot smarter with the quality of the growth, decoupling growth from primary commodity use, being fairer in the use and allocation of resources, ensuring broader access to the services and goods that raise the quality of life, and not mindlessly consuming, especially more and more material goods that aren't really raising the quality of life. We need a special focus on what actually leads to human well-being, not just what leads to a larger number in the national income accounts. Okay, here's another question, which I'd like, oops. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry. Oh, there it is. Okay, thank you. All right, what happens to sustainability when international trade agreements such as NAFTA, TTIP, which is the U.S. European Partnership Agreement on Trade and Investment, TAFTA, and now TTP, which is the partnership agreement being negotiated between the U.S. And Asian countries, counteract our attempts at sustainability by allowing corporations to sue countries that introduce environmental rules against the exploitation of resources in nature. So this is a question from a Mr. or Ms. Abisaraj in Ecuador. Here's the issue. There are several trade deals that are now underway, like the Trade and Investment Partnership deal between the US and Europe, or the TTP agreement between among several Asian countries and the United States, that are looking to increase trade and investment flows, but have some worrisome features to them that look like these very treaties could work against sustainable development. And the main issue in these treaties is what's called the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism. This isn't the only part of these treaties, but it's one that has gotten a lot of attention and deserves a lot of attention. So the investor-state dispute mechanism is a part of these treaties being pushed by the United States government in particular, which says that when a foreign investor is operating in a country that is a party to these trade agreements, that investor has the right under certain circumstances to challenge the government's decision-making in a special arbitration process under the claim that the government's rules or decisions are against the terms of the investment or somehow violate the rights of the investor. So you have company A coming from the United States operating, say, in Korea under the TTP treaty, and that American company operating in Korea doesn't like one of the measures that the Korean government has undertaken, and it says that it wants a dispute settlement process in which some arbitrators are appointed that will hear the complaint by the investor. Okay, that's the basic idea of this investor-state dispute settlement. But of course, the big question, all of the issues are in the details of this. Under what conditions can an investor challenge the decisions of a government? Is it only when the government intervenes in the specific actions of a contract, violating terms perhaps that the government had promised that investor? Or could the investor challenge the government by saying, we don't want to pay new taxes and the government is putting in a new tax code and that violates our rights as investors? So this is sometimes in legal terms talked about as whether the government is interfering in specific terms of a contract or applying laws and regulations of general applicability. It looks a little bit frightening if investors could actually stop governments from applying regulations of general applicability, because then you could see quite obviously, suppose that an investor is in a polluting industry and the government tightens up the rules against pollution, and then the investor challenges the government under the treaty and says, you can't impose new regulations on us, that's going to cut our profits. And it would be still worse, of course, if the special arbitration panel that would be called for under the treaty then sides with the investor and says the investor's profits should dominate the right of the government to regulate the environment. Well, this concern that the investor-state dispute settlement process under these treaties could jeopardize the environment or labor standards or human health standards has become a big issue. And I've looked into it myself a bit, and I have concluded that it is a big issue, that there is not a proper control or limit under these treaties of what investors can challenge governments about. And that indeed, it looks as if investors could challenge governments on the basis of regulations or laws of general applicability, and therefore prevent governments from doing their job, prevent governments from enforcing basic standards for public health or environment or labor standards or other issues just because the investor says we'll lose money that way. And if the investor had to face the local court system, it wouldn't win because the local courts would enforce the local legislation. But by creating this very special investor state dispute process that calls for a panel of arbitrators, the investor is given undue power. And who are these arbitrators? Well, it turns out they're secret. They're appointed by industry. They don't have the standards of good transparency and rule of law that we would expect in this kind of legal process. So I believe your question is very well taken. I myself have spoken out against this investor-state dispute settlement process. It does not seem to have the basic protections that are needed. I'm not very excited about TTP or about the TTIP, so-called. The first one being the Asia-US agreement, the second being the Europe-US agreement. Unless sustainable development is put at the very heart of these agreements so that everybody understands that nothing in such free trade and investment agreements should jeopardize the achievement of sustainable development. Indeed, such treaties should prioritize sustainable development rather than weaken the ability for sustainable development. So here's another very interesting question. Dr. Sachs, this is from Neja Larisi. Dr. Sachs, we often talk about minimum threshold for extreme poverty. In other words, keeping the bottom above the survival threshold. Shouldn't we start talking about upper thresholds for extreme wealth, above which one is entitled to some responsibility towards poverty? I think this is really an excellent question. Now, it's got lots of different aspects. I think this will be the last question that I'll address this time, so I can go into it in a little bit of depth. First, we probably do want to pay most attention to the plight of the poor rather than to the extreme benefits of rich, in one sense. The plight of the poor is a life and death issue. If we can ensure that every poor person can meet basic needs and stay alive, have basic access to health care so that horrific events like the Ebola epidemic are brought quickly under control, not left out of control, as is the case in the very poor countries of West Africa, then we would be fulfilling the mandate of really ensuring that everybody can have their basic human rights fulfilled. And I believe that we should focus our energies and attention on meeting the needs of the poor. I very much like a doctrine of Christianity, and especially of the Roman Catholic Church, which is called the preferential option for the poor. And the idea of the preferential option for the poor is that special attention should be given to the poor, because for the poor, resources are not a matter of luxury or convenience, they're a matter of life and death. Now, some people say that's enough. Just focus on the problems of the poor. Don't be envious about the success of the wealthy. And indeed, maybe it is the encouragement of the ability to be wealthy that gives economic motivation and thereby economic progress that helps lift poor people out of poverty. I'm not so keen on that argument also, because I think it's a little bit of an oversimplification. Our societies tend to glorify the super rich and unduly empower the super rich. This is really true in the United States, where the super rich are not only beneficiaries of their huge wealth, but they're beneficiaries of huge political influence as well. And the reason is that politicians have their hand out for campaign contributions and for lobbying and for employment for their families and so forth. And therefore, there's plenty of evidence that the super rich have a completely out of proportion weight in the political process. And this they have used over time to further weaken any constraints on behavior, even paying taxes, that prevent them from becoming even richer. So there is a problem not only with the crisis of poverty, but with the exceptional power of the rich. And I think that this definitely needs attention. Now, there are many ways to attend to that. One is through adequate taxation. And I believe, like Thomas Piketty and others, that we need a wealth tax together with our income taxes and consumption taxes, because the distribution of wealth is so extremely unequal that a wealth tax would help to meet the needs of the very poor and the rest of society without really taking much at all away from the super rich. We also need to immunize our political systems from the power of the super rich. Some places do this. The Scandinavian democracies, for example, have short campaigns where public financing plays a very large role. Access to the media is on an equitable basis, and where money does not play an undue role in the political process. The United States is on the other extreme, I would say, where now every 2-year election cycle, like the one we will have in November 2014, is now costing, or not costing, I should say, rich people are spending billions of dollars to influence the outcomes of these elections. Probably the 2012 election cycle, meaning all of the campaigning up to November 2014, will cost perhaps $7 or $8 billion when the total is made. And the 2016 presidential election is probably going to be a $10 billion election, I would guess. And this is also because the US Supreme Court has taken off all constraints on the capacity of the rich to give campaign contributions, and even on companies to give campaign contributions. So the US Supreme Court, in very bad decisions, has further empowered the super rich. So in this sense, Neja, I think you're onto something very important, which is that a fair society absolutely must pay first attention to the poor, but it should not let the rich run away with all the prize. And it should avoid at all costs a vicious circle in which the rich get very rich and then use their wealth to subvert the political process, to rewrite the rules so that they can get even richer. And that gives them even more prerogative to rewrite the political rules, and so on, in a vicious spiral of wealth and political domination that leads to a kind of plutocracy, a government by big money, rather than a democracy, a government by votes of the individual citizens. And the United States has gone far in that direction. The political science evidence is that only the views of the richest 10% of the population have a systematic say in public policy in the United States. I've written a bit about this in a book called The Price of Civilization that I wrote a couple of years ago, and that describes how the political process has been captured by the super rich. And there are some very important studies in the last couple of years that tend to confirm that. So finally, I would say that the social ethos matters. There is a difference of the social ethos in the United States, which tends to lionize, to praise, to fawn over the super rich, versus the attitudes in parts of Europe, for example, where the rich are supposed to live modestly and not flaunt their wealth. And it's considered socially bad behavior to use wealth for very public or very ostentatious purposes. Social ethics matter. And the United States had a illustrious case of one of our richest magnates of the end of the 19th century, Andrew Carnegie, who made a lot of money in the steel industry. And he became America's leading philanthropist. In fact, all of the Carnegie Foundation and the Carnegie Institutes for Peace around the world and Carnegie Libraries and many other contributions come from his philanthropy. And he wrote something called The Gospel of Wealth at the end of the 19th century, where he said, I'm very good at making money, but I don't regard that money as my own. I regard that money as held in trust for the whole community. And so he said, I'm going to give away my money and use it in a way to serve the broader well-being of the community. And he said for a rich person to die rich was a shame, because a rich person has a social responsibility. Well, I believe that such social mores and ethics can make a difference. We've kind of lost part of that philosophy in recent years, though I would say that Bill Gates and Melinda Gates exemplify it because they're giving away tens of billions of their own dollars for the public good. And other very rich people should do the same. It would make a huge difference. It would help to ensure that every poor person can meet their basic needs. And it would also help to make a fairer society where at the political level, we have one person, one vote rather than $1, one vote. Well, let me thank all of you for the Google Hangout today. We'll do this again very soon. I only got to a few of the questions, but continue to write, don't lose heart, and we'll take on more when we get together shortly. And please do enjoy the course. I'll be tweeting. Follow me on at Jeff D. Sachs, and I will be using Twitter also to send out notes and linkages and articles and news that I'd like you to see. Take care and see you again soon.